Trump is a political genius. Or is he? Welcome to the Open Minds Show, folks. I'm your host, Christopher Balkaran, who's trying to inject a little bit more of moderation in our increasingly politically polarized world. And folks, there has been a lot of coverage in the Kamala Harris election loss to Donald Trump. And in this video, I'm really not going to rehash that because a lot has happened. I'm going to say this, though. I do think that inheriting delegates just does not set a candidate up for success. There's a reason why the delegate system exists, and that's for a potential candidate to make their case across 50 states of different voters, and Kamala Harris wasn't given that opportunity. She inherited delegates that were won and fought for by Joe Biden, and by that very act, I think the Democratic Party set Kamala Harris up for massive defeat. I think, to be honest, she wasn't able to refine her position or create positions on many public policy initiatives. And as a result, she wasn't able to craft her own narrative on big issues. But speaking of crafting their own narratives, folks, I've always long suspected something, and I want to share this with you. I've long suspected that Donald Trump has taken over otherwise left-leaning policies as his own, and he's owned them, thereby drowning out the Democrats from an ability for them to carve out their own policy position. I'm going to go through a couple examples where I think this is the case, and if this is so, and if you agree, then Donald Trump and or his team are political masterminds. Okay, so the first example I was going to share is the anti-war campaign. Now, for as long as I can remember, back in university and even before, it was the left that historically advocated for anti-war policies, non-interventionist policies. This goes back to the Vietnam era, the Vietnam War, but also I remember in the early 2000s, many protests against George W. Bush as this warmonger, him and Dick Cheney. All they do is fund endless wars. It was the left and their argument against the right. They start these endless wars. They go on forever. It's part of the military-industrial complex. It's this whole conspiracy that the right has to fund money to Lockheed Martin. It's like government contracts are being sent there. It's this whole thing. And this was furthered by many left-leaning thinkers like Noam Chomsky. I'm sure many of us remember Noam Chomsky, who categorized these policies as imperialist, detrimental to the United States. Naomi Klein wrote about U.S. imperialism. This was a common talking point of the late 90s, early 2000s academic thinkers on the left. And Trump has capitalized on this. He himself criticizes the endless wars that people within his own party suggested and did. He did not fully withdraw from conflicts, but he would always criticize the Bush administration and other Republican administrations when they got things wrong, including the Iraq War, which Trump has been against. Now, what's interesting here is that Trump himself has overtaken the anti-war, endless war rhetoric, and he's made it his own. He hasn't said anti-war, but he said endless war. And in doing so, it cuts the Democrats at their knees. The Democrats can no longer be anti-war, really, when you have a Republican who's openly saying that he's against endless wars. What could possibly be the Democrats' position in that? That we're even more against endless wars than Donald Trump? That we're going to bring back even more troops than Donald Trump says he will? I mean, he's just overtaken that policy to win over more moderates. And I would argue, I mean, who's really in favor of endless wars? I can't imagine like far-right extremists are for endless wars. So I think it's just a bad policy, to be honest, that may have had some merit as the United States was building up its hegemony. But now, in this day and age, I don't think it holds any merit, and it's a policy idea that has long lost its favor on both the right and the left. But I would argue that Trump taking over this position cuts the Democrats at its knees on its anti-war sentiment, Trump says, yeah, I'm also against war, and I think it's endless. These endless wars need to end, and I support that. The second policy area that I think I've always suspected sounds so much like left-wing politicians from years past is on protecting jobs. Now, I remember Bernie Sanders' labor unions fighting against NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement of the early to mid 1990s. I remember there being debates here in Canada. John Turner, the Liberal Party, saying that signing on to NAFTA is sending jobs away from Canada, selling us out to the Americans, that we're just going to move to these low-income countries for our jobs, that so many jobs are now at stake. And the reason why is because these countries don't have labor laws. They can skirt around that, and they'll attract bigger investments from multinationals to set up shop there. And there were many economists. Has globalization gone too far? The race to the bottom in wages. This was just emblematic of the left. I remember reading Naomi Klein's No Logo. I remember reading about maquiladoras in Mexico. I remember reading about all these, these major civil rights movements in favor of labor, of protecting labor in the United States. Well, guess what? Donald Trump has taken on trade protectionism. He wants to bring jobs back to the United States. Now, we can debate whether his rhetoric matches reality, but his rhetoric is very much aligned with what Bernie Sanders would have argued for in the mid 1990s. Protecting American manufacturing, renegotiating NAFTA and the USMCA was to prioritize U.S. jobs and industries, appealing to working class voters who left completely out of previous trade agreements. Very, very interesting. Now, another area that I think Trump has, again, really interesting to see that he's overtaken the left on, has been infrastructure. Now, infrastructure spending, this has been something the left, FDR during the New Deal really prided themselves on. We invest in roads and bridges. The other side doesn't. They're too busy taking that money and spending it on endless wars. Well, Trump doubles down on infrastructure and says he's going to spend 1.5 trillion to rebuild roads, bridges, airports. Some of us remember his campaign from 2016 where he says, he flies into LaGuardia and other airports and he just thinks it's an absolute mess and he wants it to be so much better, et cetera, et cetera. And so his ability to double down on infrastructure spending, again, cuts the Democrats at their knees. And so when you look at these policy areas, anti-war, trade protectionism, infrastructure investments, there's a few others, his criticisms of big tech being too powerful, similar to what Elizabeth Warren said. His wanting to look at healthcare costs as well. Drug prices as another example. I mean, there's many policy areas where I would argue Trump does take on more left-leaning policies. Now, I don't know if the MAGA crowd would really like to hear all of these policy areas, but as an observer, as a Canadian observer, I find it politically masterful that someone gets into power and is able to overtake some left-leaning policies from those who support them. And it leaves voters in this quagmire. Do you vote for Trump based on personality? Some would say no. But if you are in rural parts of the United States where your job has left your community and Trump is saying, I'm going to bring this back, I'm going to bring back your well-paying middle-class job, what do the Democrats say to that? Right? So it's in many ways political mastery, the ability to steal your opponent's base by framing it in a way that still resonates with the Republican base. And I think this is masterful, and I think it's something that we should talk about a lot more of. And perhaps I'll do that more on this channel, on the Open Minds show, because I think it's important we do unpack this a little bit more. And I'll argue, the final thing I'll say, as a millennial, I think millennials generally are progressive, perhaps, on some policies, but we all remember in university and college reading up about these issues, trade protectionism, warmongering, etc. We remember those protests. And we have a president now who's against those things that was once championed by the left. And perhaps millennials, Gen Xers, the generation above us, older than us, maybe the Trump administration recognizes that millennials and Gen Xers are the majority of the population, or will be, or are. And they remember back in the day what resonated with them in universities, and perhaps they're taking over these policies in a masterful way to leave people questioning, what do they really want? Can they look past the rhetoric and to the policy? And if you look at the policy, it's very, very much aligned with what some on the left had fought for so many years. I would love to know what you think about this, though. So give me a like, give me a subscribe. Let me know in the comments below. Do you think this is political mastery by Trump, or do you think this is just coincidental? Let me know in the comment section below. Thanks, everyone, and I'll catch you in the next one.